Hi everyone, so we're on the sort of the last stage of construction of our MiG-29 version 1. We just need to put in the vertical pieces of the foam and install our motor. So just a couple things I wanted to show you here. Because the battery, you have to put the battery in from the bottom. Sometimes, you know, if you're out at the flying field, it's easier to flip the plane upside down, you know, so that it's stable. And then you can get your battery sorted out. So what I've done, you may be able to see it more easily here on the cockpit here if you want, or the canopy. I just put spread a very thin bit of epoxy along the top of the foam and down the sides, because the plane, when it's sitting upside down, is going to rest on this. And then I also did the same thing, it might be a little harder to see, but I also did the same thing, just a very, very thin layer of epoxy along here and about 1/4 of an inch down. And what that's going to do is it's just going to, you know, if you flip your plane over, after a while this is going to get, you know, the corner's going to get bent. And I mean, you could use tape if you want. You know, just once you put the epoxy on, it's nice and strong, and the epoxy's not going to come off. Tape may eventually come off, so that's easier to do when these pieces are are flat. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do in this stage, I've already got my glue gun nicely warming up here. So again, as we always do, we're just going to dry fit. And actually, let me just back up a little bit. I just want to show you. So after yesterday, you know, I've got my magnets installed on both sides. I cleaned up my wires here. You know, I just sort of bundled them up, put a little zip tie here. And then over on this side, I've actually just put a little bit of tape, just to tape those down. You don't want those flapping around. You know, they could end up, if that happens, you could end up with something, you know, pulling out of your receiver and having issues with your plane, or, you know, stuff flopping around, getting back caught in the prop slot. So I just, you know, you can just kind of clean it up whatever way you want. You can even use, I've even used little dabs of hot glue to hold the wires down as well. But you just want to make sure that those are not going to go anywhere, and that there's no danger of them getting back into the prop. Okay, I just put, as you can see here, I've also done a very quick paint scheme. Unfortunately, I had a bit of bleed through here, but mostly I just wanted to make sure that, you know, when I start to do the flying series at the field, that hopefully we've got a scheme that, you know, hopefully will show up on video, and it's not going to add a whole lot of weight. On the bottom here, I like to put this. I don't paint the bottoms of my planes. I like to leave those white, just because you know, it's a very stark difference between a white bottom and a painted top. But I do like to put these 2 strips of black here. This is just black magic marker. It just kind of gives me a, you know, a bold statement that, okay, that's the bottom. And again, I just, for these little engine nozzles here, I just did that with black magic marker as well. Same with this and my engine nozzles on the top. So, you know, you paint it whatever way you want. Just be careful, you know, especially if this is your first plane. Don't go too crazy with a wild paint scheme. You know, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time. Paint, you know, it does add weight if you don't pay attention. And then, you know, you want to spend a whole lot of time on a great paint job, and, you know, God forbid things go wrong in the first few flights. And, you know, like I've mentioned before, I've mentioned in one of my workshop videos, I've got planes. I'm currently flying an Su-30 version 4 that I just did with magic marker, so didn't add any weight, really quick. Okay, so we're gonna, like everything else, we're gonna dry fit this. You'll notice I've extended back here from this slot. I've extended back here, and I've just made a couple little tick marks for myself, because this is a fairly long piece. So you want to make sure that, you know, when you're putting it down, that it gets aligned nice and straight all the way along. What you don't want to have happen is you put the thing in and you're gluing it, you're not paying attention, and it's curved way over, because then it acts like a big trim tab or a control surface, and it's going to affect how your plane flies. So that's why I made that mark. So we're just going to dry fit it in here. So that looks pretty good. Now up here at the nose, what you want to do is you want to sort of look, you know, look down the nose and make sure, you know, these 2 pieces here on either side can move up and down. So what you want to avoid is, something like that. I mean, obviously that's a gross exaggeration, but you want to, I find actually, you'll note there's kind of like a little squared off bit here, and I find if I put the bottom of the foam here, which is, actually part of the wing plate, sort of right in line with the bottom of this squared off piece, then that makes it seem, pretty flat. What you want to avoid is, either having that curved up or curved down too much, or then again out of, one up and one down kind of thing, because what that'll happen is, again, it's going to act like a control surface or a trim tab, and when your plane is flying along, it's going to, do some funky things. So you've got a couple of different options. You can either pin it, once you sort of get it flat. Probably the easiest thing to do, and that's what I'm going to do, is I'm just going to get mine aligned here, and then I'm just going to pop a pin sort of right through all of this foam. Oops. There we go. So anyway, so that pin will hold it in place. You can see there just till we get some glue down. Now I'm just going to be able to. So I'm happy with my fit. Everything's looking good. So I'm just going to flip it up here a little bit, or maybe I should do this. We'll do this pinning stage later. Now that I think about it. Okay, so you've got a cutout right here that sort of fits down onto this solid piece. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put it on. Just put some hot glue along there. Okay. Press it back down. Okay, and then just make sure that those, that makes good contact. That's kind of the only butt joint that I'm going to use. You could also put it back here. In fact, mistakes as I go along here. Sorry, folks. So I'm also going to put it along here. And this makes more sense to me now, because that will allow it to anchor the back part. Okay. Pop that down in there again. Okay, make sure that this is lined up. And again, what you can do here is, once you've got that lined up, is you can pop a pin down through there. Make sure that stays there. And then get our angle tool and just make sure that we're relatively perpendicular there. Okay, so that's looking good. We'll make final adjustments after we run the glue down either side. Okay, so now I'm going to go back again and do this. Put my pin through up in the nose again. Okay, so that'll hold that, and then just have a look down. Just kind of give it a check on sort of on both sides to make sure that it's looking pretty straight. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And my wing plate looks pretty true there, so I'm happy with that. So again, just like when we did the nacelles on the bottom, I'm just going to take my glue gun now and run a bead of glue all the way along here where the vertical piece and the wing plate meet. Again, just not globbing it on too long, just a nice even bead. Okay, so I've done that side, and then I'm just going to do this side. Sorry, I know it's a bad angle for you, but I just want to be able to see what I'm doing here. You get the point, hopefully. All right. Hot glue is, you always have all these little all these little hairs. Okay, so that's looking pretty straight. So we're just going to leave those pins in now for a few minutes. Now, another place you want to glue is actually just let me. Just going to highlight it here so you can. There we go. Okay, so there's that section here where the the top piece of the this sort of section of the vertical part of the fuselage sticks down through here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab myself some scrap foam and make sure. Looks like I need another glue stick here. Sorry. Alright, so we'll load up our weapon here, and then I'm just going to run, just run some glue, run the bead sort of right down the center of just this area right here. Just so the glue's making contact just in that area there. Whoop, and then again, just like we did on the top, and I'm just going to drag it sort of sideways here because I don't want to smear hot glue on my Velcro. We're just kind of driving the hot glue down in there. Alright, and while we've got it flipped upside down, fortunately I remembered this now, we also just want to do, you can see there's a little sort of piece of that vertical thing that sticks out the bottom to sort of make it look like more like a MiG-29 nose. And we also just want to run a bead of glue along the side there. Okay. Okay. So there we go. So there's our vertical fuselage glued in, good to go. So I'm just going to let this, because it's such a long glue joint, I'm just going to actually let it sit for a few minutes and make sure the glue is good and hard. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install my motor before I put my vertical stabilizers on. I just find it's very, very easier to do that way without the vertical stabilizers on. Now the way that I like to actually mount my motor mount, pardon me, is I attach the motor to the motor mount first. Screw it on there nice and snug. The reason being is that now it'll make it. You remember very early on, we drew this line down the center so that we can get the motor aligned, in the yaw axis, I guess, if you want. The other thing you want to make sure before we start is the reason that we've already got our servos connected. So you want to make sure that these, your elevons are completely level. And because we left that piece on this sort of, oops, everything's going crazy today. Okay, so because we left this piece of, this triangle here of horizontal stabilizer, I find the easiest way to do that, to make sure that my elevon is completely level, is to lay, just lay a ruler on the horizontal stabilizer, and then just make sure that the elevon is stable there, so that I know that it's good and flat. Because what we're going to do is when we're getting our motor aligned, is I'm actually going to look sort of straight down this way to level the motor in the pitch axis. Okay, so we want the motor to be mounted as level and as centered as possible. If we find later on that for some reason the plane is constantly wanting to zoom or dive, you can always play around with it and shim it a little bit afterwards. But I find it's much easier to do that. I used to just do the wooden piece by itself, and I found that more often than not, maybe because of my bad eyes, I used to run into issues with the motor not being quite aligned properly. So I'm just going to take a pause right now, make sure that my vertical piece of my fuselage is good and ready. Let's just talk quickly about these motor mounts. Okay, obviously this motor mount it's essentially the same as the one that's on the template and the plan view file, which I should have, I've shared with you, or is available through my blog post with permission from RC Powers. The top is cut off because on a lot of the planes, the NAMC planes that I have worked with, it's easier. You need to have this cut off, but you can make them. I know people have built them square. If you go on the RC Powers forum, I think there's a thread there about 3D printed parts. I know guys have printed them. If you have a 3D printer, guys have you can learn about printing them from home on a 3D printer. They can be square, rectangular. They don't necessarily need to be round. The main thing is you need to make them big enough so that it fits the hole pattern on the X mount, so you can mount the motor where you see my 4 screws sticking out here. You don't necessarily need to drill these holes. I think they were originally meant for cooling, but I don't really think they do much for cooling. But it is important that you drill out a hole here in the center, because the bottom part of the shaft of the motor is right there. So what you want to make sure is you don't have any issues where the base of this shaft is going to bind on the motor mount at all. So again, you want to take that out of there. But like I said, I've known guys that have taken used old gift cards, maybe taken cut 2 of them out of an old gift card and then laminate them together, maybe with some some super glue or something like that. And those have worked just fine for guys. And again, they don't need to be round or semi-round. They can even be square. I think it's also important to make sure that you have this little notch cut out, though, because it makes it a lot easier to get the motor aligned when you're putting it on. And I also like to have the prop on, because what I'll do is, before I actually hook the motor up, is I'm going to just slowly spin the prop by hand and make sure that I don't have anything in my prop slot area that's going to interfere with the prop. It's always better to do that slow by hand, and if it's hitting the foam or it's super close to the foam, you can always trim it a little bit out. You plug the motor in and whack, fire it up, and the next thing your prop is chewing up your plane. So it's always best to do it by hand. All right, so we'll just take a quick break and let everything get good and hardened up here, and I'll be right back with you folks. All right, folks, time to install our motor here. I should mention, a lot of people use, these are just the little screws. Normally when you buy servos, you'll get a couple of these screws, so that if you were mounting them in a plane that was made out of wood or balsa, you can actually secure the servo in with these little screws. These are really handy. They're lightweight, and then it recycles the screws you get. And of course, with this build, we used 2 servos. They were brand new servos, so you would have 4 screws, which is the perfect number to mount your motor. Okay, so it's always a good thing, again, as always, we do is dry fit. We're just going to dry fit the motor, and just make sure there's not any major issues with how it's going to align. Now we're going to mount the motor with epoxy, but you also, what you also want to make sure is that your glue gun, you've got your glue gun plugged in, and it's good and hot, because what we're going to do is once we apply the epoxy and we get the motor in there, and then play around with it a little bit, make sure that it's dead center and level and exactly the way that we want it. We're actually going to use a little bit of hot glue to just sort of spot weld it in place, so that we don't have to sit there for 5 or 10 minutes waiting for the epoxy to harden. So the hot glue will just help with that. But it's important. Believe me, I've done this in the past where I've forgotten. But it's important to have your hot glue gun plugged in and ready to go. Okay, so I'm just going to get my epoxy mixed up. Okay, that should be more than enough. Okay. So there's my epoxy. Give it a good stir. Okay, so I'm just going to use my my toothpick for this, and I know it's going to be hard for me to show you, but I'm just putting it, sort of along the X or the plus sign part of all of this foam. Don't be shy with it. I mean, don't glob on a tablespoonful of it or something, but make sure you've got a good amount there on the foam. So there we go. So now I've got my epoxy on there. So we're going to take the motor, and obviously again make sure that the wires are going down towards the bottom of the plane, because we're going to run the. I mean, you could always, if you did it wrong, you can always take the motor off and flip it upside down. But okay, come on, you. YouTube instructional video curse. Get on there. All right, so there we go. Okay, so now I'm looking. I'm looking to make sure that the bullet nut, or the nut here on the end, is aligned with straight with that line that we drew down the center. Okay, so and then the other thing I want to do is I'm looking, sort of straight down here, and I want the back plate to cut that bullet nut sort of right in half, so the bullet nut is aligned. So I know it's difficult for me to show, but hopefully you get the idea. So I'm looking at it this way to make sure that it's aligned in the pitch axis, the up and down this way, so that I'm not angled down or angled up, and then lining it up with the line that I drew down the dead center of the back plate, to make sure that it's it's not angled left or right, so that it's going to push the airplane the wrong way. Okay, so you can also check the pitch alignment sort of from the side here. So once I'm sort of happy with that, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my glue gun, and you've just got the little bits of wood here that are over the edge of the foam, and I'm just going to put a little dab right there, and again over on this side. And what we're doing here is, like I said, we're just sort of spot welding our motor mount, and then you can do the same thing on the bottom here. Again, just a little tiny amount. Be really careful with this. You don't want to, put any obviously into the motor, or drag one of those little threads or hairs that come off of hot glue. You don't want to put any of that in or on your motor if you can help it. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of give myself one last check here as my hot glue is setting up. Okay, just you can just hold it for a little bit till the hot glue sets. Okay, so I'm pretty happy. I'm very happy with my alignment now. I think I've got it pretty much dead center in the yaw axis, and maybe a little. So I just need to. It's tilting down on me here. Okay, so I'm just going to hold that up a little bit, and then maybe even another small dab of hot glue. Here, I'll just do it this way so I can pay attention to what I'm doing. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you get the idea. Now I'm going to need to hold mine a little bit longer here and maybe fix up my hot glue on the bottom. Again, this is kind of the YouTuber's instructional video curse. It never seems to go exactly the way you want it to. There, so that hot glue will sort of hold things in place while the epoxy hardens. Okay, folks, so there we go. So what you can do now is, what I actually like to do is I'll just kind of set the plane sort of, I'll just show you here. I'll just kind of set the plane on its nose as straight up and down as possible, maybe leaning up against something so that it doesn't fall over and damage the wing or anything. And then just leave that, this for a good, 10-15 minutes. Make sure the epoxy is really nice and hard, and then you're good to go. So the next, I'm just going to leave that now. Make sure that this is good and straight. Get it all sorted out, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about final motor installation. Put the vertical stabs on, and we are done. Okay, so be back with you. Hi folks, back with you again. I'm being ably assisted. I don't know if you can see him here, but my co-pilot's back here over my shoulder, my dog Bentley, supervising, make sure that I do this last stage correctly. Alright, so I've got my motor connected, and it's running in the proper direction. Again, I'm using just a standard sort of puller prop, so it's going to spin this way. The main thing is to make sure on every prop, let me just get a prop here for a training aid here. On every prop, there should be numbers on the very front. Like this is a 6x4, so it's actually got 6x4 here, which is the length of the prop in inches and the pitch. So the numbers, those numbers always want to be facing the direction of travel. So whether you're using a puller style or a puller style prop like I am, or a pusher style, I know some people prefer to use pusher style. Doesn't matter, the numbers always need to be facing the direction of travel. If you put the prop on backwards, your plane is more than likely not going to fly. So always make sure that your numbers on the face of the prop are facing the direction of travel. And you can always, you can also tell, you get used to looking at the prop. The leading edge of the prop is quite a bit thicker because it's actually shaped like a small airfoil. We want to make sure that it's obviously spinning in the right direction. The thicker edge of the prop blade should always be leading the way as the prop spins. Again, like a bit of an airfoil. The other thing that I've done after apologize for my buffoonery getting my motor aligned there. I don't know what my issue was, but I guess I didn't have Bentley back here helping me then. So I've gone back now that my epoxy on the face of the wooden mount has fully cured. I've gone back and I've just double checked here on these seams. There was a couple of little small gaps. So what I've used actually, if you have it around, it actually works really, really well. It's this sort of this expanding Gorilla Glue. So what I do is, again, I just take a piece of wax paper, put a very little small dab. This stuff expands about 10 times the size. It's already started to expand here quite a bit, but it helps fill in any little gaps between your motor mount and the foam. And when it dries, it's like super, super hard. I mean, epoxy would work just fine if you don't have any of this stuff, but I've come to trust this Gorilla Glue. And all I do to accelerate it is after I put it down on the wax paper, is I just have several toothpicks, and I'll sort of put the toothpick in my mouth and just get it nice and wet, because it accelerates and expands faster after it's been misted. You could always mist it with water afterwards, but I don't want to spray any water in my motor or bother taking the motor off. It'll be probably within an hour or so it'll be fully cured. I just got to be careful not to touch it. Okay, so I'm just going to show you my motor is spinning. Got my transmitter on. Okay, my kill switch is off, and we're just going to plug our battery in here. So we're good to go. Okay, so I've already I'm going to just disconnect the battery here before I show you this. So like I mentioned earlier, I've already spun the prop by hand. It's spinning nice and freely. I don't have any real close close calls with any of the foam. What you do want to watch for is that if you spin it around and you find that the tip of the prop, let's say, is only like maybe a millimeter or two away from some foam, is you want to kind of trim that out of there, because what's going to happen over the plane is going to flex. There's just nothing you can really do about it. The plane is going to flex a certain amount in the air, so you want to give yourself more than a couple of millimeters of clearance. I've got probably about 3 or 4 millimeters for my prop. So we'll see how that goes. I'm pretty happy with that. But again, this is why you put the prop on, and before you hammer the motor, is you run it and just check that those things are okay. All right, kill switch is on. Plug it in. Okay. Alright, we are good to go. Okay, so she's spinning. That sounds a little bit loud. It's probably because the prop slot is so small. I'm just going to double check my motor again later, make sure that it's spinning properly. Alright, so we're ready to put the very last parts of the plane on, our vertical stabilizers. Okay, so my battery's unplugged. I'm just going to get rid of my transmitter here, get that out of the way. So my hot glue gun is nice and hot. So what I've gone and done here is I've highlighted, you can see here I've highlighted, there's the slot where the tab from the nacelle comes up through the bottom. So that's a good guideline to make sure that you when you glue your vertical stabilizer on, that it's good and straight. You don't want it angled in or out, because then again it's gonna act like a huge rudder, and it's gonna make your plane yaw or pull or roll or whatever different directions. So I just highlighted those, as you can see, mostly for the video, but I will be using those for alignment. So again, like we always do, we'll dry fit it. So that's fitting in okay. Tab's fitting in okay. All right, we're good to go. The other thing I want to check and make sure is that the back, again, just like we did with the nacelles, that the back of the horizontal stabilizer or vertical stabilizer is not interfering. I just noticed on this one side I've got a tiny bit here, so I'm just going to shave a millimeter or two off of that. Again, this is probably something I should have done probably before I painted them, but we're just going to trim that off. And then presto changeo, we'll just fix that right up with a little blue magic marker. Nobody's going to know the difference. There we go, fixed. Yeah, a little bit of white there. Bingo bango, and we're done. There we go. So yeah, so if you are going to paint it, that's probably something you want to check before you paint it. Like I obviously didn't do. All right, so we got our square here again. We want to make sure that these dry nice and square. So we're going to put the glue along the bottom first. There we go. Okay. Boom, in we go. Okay, we're lined up with that tab in the back. And again, make sure that it's aligned. Okay. So, yeah, we'll just do the other one now. Okay. Pop that in there. Again, make sure that it's aligned. And double check to make sure that that's perpendicular. Okay. So then I'll just do one here. Again, we're just going to go along the seam where the vertical stabilizer goes into or is mated with the wing plate, and just run maybe the hot glue here won't take too long. Boom. Same thing on the other side. Okay, so we're done. So again, we just want to make sure after we've run that bead, we just want to make sure again we're staying completely perpendicular, which we are. Okay, so that's good. So now we're just going to let that done, let that harden, and our plane is done. We've got ourselves a a MiG-29 version 1. So one thing I'm going to do here before I come back is I'm just going to kind of go over the plane, make sure you know, that I've got all my joints have been glued to my satisfaction. Everything's good to go. Everything's you know, connected, hooked up properly. So I'm going to do a good once-over inspection of my plane. Let all of this this glue on my vertical stabilizers cure, and then we're going to come back and we're just going to talk about some last-minute steps to get the center of gravity correct, and you know, just some thoughts on getting our elevons and everything set up prior to our maiden flight. Okay, so I'll be back with you for the final stage, and you know, just sort of my final thoughts. So be back in a bit.